Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, the Erdogan government bans Twitter, and the Turkish Twitterati fight back. The Pakistani edition of the International New York Times with just some of the news that's fit to print. The media in Hong Kong and the Beijing effect. It took a while, but it's happening. And pick a brand, any brand. We've got the pictures that can sell it. Last month, we reported on demonstrations in Turkey over a new internet law which allows the government to shut down any website without going through the courts. The law has since claimed its first victims, Twitter and YouTube, and that has led to an all-out online media war. Turks go to the polls Sunday in local elections that are seen as a critical bellwether ahead of the presidential election later this year. Prime Minister Erdogan's opponents say his online clampdown is just a cynical short-term political move. Twitter and YouTube have been used to spread a growing story about government corruption. But if Erdogan was out to limit the damage by taking down Twitter, Turks have gone to school on how to circumvent the ban, with other social media sites, news outlets, and Twitter itself teaching them how. Result, a reported 138% increase on Twitter in Turkey in the immediate aftermath of the ban. Not what the Prime Minister had in mind when he said he could eradicate Twitter and show the world the power of the Turkish Republic. Our starting point this week is Istanbul. The die was cast for this story a little more than a week ago by Prime Minister Erdogan at an election rally in the city of Bursa.
Twitter, Mwitter. We have a court order now. We will wipe out all of these. The international community can say this and that. I don't care at all.
It turned into a lesson in futility, a fusillade of resistance. Turks are experienced at circumventing bans on online content. And in this case, they got help from various websites and a few news organizations that showed them step by step how to connect to Twitter and get the word out. The Twitter sphere caught fire, and despite some legitimate concerns over how Twitter is used in Turkey, the Erdogan government got burned.
Particularly in non-Western countries, whenever you see in a liberal democratic society like Turkey, for instance, whenever you see a difference over a case, such as Twitter or social media and issues like that, the tension is easily translated into the language of authoritarianism and backwardness. We right now have a difference over a number of issues between Turkey and Twitter. Such a different position could be seen in any kind of democracy or state in the world.
Twitter is not treating all her clients equally. For example, in the Western countries, like in the United States or in France or in Germany, there are many cases which go to court if there is any violation of privacy and personal rights. And Twitter accepts these court decisions and blocks access to the material. But in countries like Turkey and Ukraine and Egypt, for example, although there are court decisions, Twitter doesn't show respect to these court decisions.
International criticism of Prime Minister Erdogan over his ban of Twitter plays into his hands, especially among his religious conservative voters who have a strong proclivity to believe in conspiracy theories and to have a negative, suspicious view of alleged foreign intervention in Turkey. So Prime Minister Erdogan, in the heat of an election period, has adopted a very strong language against Twitter and other social media websites to marshal support, especially of his core supporters.
Turkish governments have tried this before. In the 1990s, it was illegal to broadcast in Kurdish, so people in the southeast who wanted to receive those broadcasts bought satellite dishes. The government then tried to confiscate them. So this rhetoric about banning Twitter is about as realistic as trying to ban satellite dishes. The government has failed to eradicate Twitter. Millions of people in Turkey today have been able to access Twitter by downloading VPNs. Therefore, I do not think that the Prime Minister's rhetoric about Twitter is realistic.
Neither, for that matter, does the Turkish president, Abdullah Gül, who co-founded the ruling AK party with Tayyip Erdogan. Gül said in a tweet that Erdogan's ban on Twitter was unacceptable. Within a week, the government shut down YouTube as well. For the past 3 months, both YouTube and Twitter have contained a raft of audio and video files, evidence, it is alleged, of corruption in the Erdogan government. The files appear to be the work of Gulenists, members of an influential Islamic political and social movement led by a cleric named Fethullah Gulen, who for years backed Erdogan's AKP. However, that relationship has soured, leading to the posting of the corruption files online starting December 17th. Most consist of phone recordings illegally obtained. Erdogan has called Gulen a parallel state within Turkey, and analysts say stopping the posting of more corruption files ahead of the March 30th local elections is what's driving the Prime Minister's online crackdown.
So in this war, the Gülenist networks always used social networks like YouTube and especially Twitter as weapons to publish some illegal wiretappings. And since December 17, 2013, Turkey lives in illegally recorded tape scandals almost every day. So that is actually the main motivation behind Twitter's ban.
Turkey is going through a tremendous or extraordinary times right now, and that time refers not to the election, but it refers to the struggle between what we call as state within state in Turkey, or what we call as shadow states, fighting against using illegally acquired tapes and recordings and using these as a means to delegitimize the government, to create certain kind of chaos, political chaos in Turkey. And extraordinary times requires extraordinary responses.
The key here is the December 17th graft scandal. The Prime Minister has argued that the scandal has been conducted by a parallel state within the state. He has tried to convince public opinion that the internet bill was a necessity. So those who are close to the AK Party have been influenced by this rhetoric. The rest have perceived this bill as a hasty attempt to block any further revelations. They have perceived it as a new form of censorship.
Prime Minister Erdogan still has the heaviest weaponry in this media war, since the bulk of television news channels still support his government.
Başbakan inlerine gireceğiz derken bunu kastediyor. Yakında Cumhuriyet tarihinin en büyük örgüt soruşturmasına ve örgüt davasına şahit olacaksınız.
Some do it because their corporate owners do so much business with the government. Some fear the consequences of crossing the Prime Minister. The cracks in Erdogan's political armor became clear to all during last year's Gezi Park protests, which were first coordinated and then covered online. However, less than half the Turkish population has internet access, and even fewer Turks are on Twitter.
Twitter is used by around 15% of the Turkish population, which seems to imply that Twitter is limited among the tech-savvy, globally connected Turks who tend to oppose the government and do not support Prime Minister Erdogan, whereas his core supporters, who are normally religious, conservative, pious Turks, do not usually use Twitter on a daily basis.
Prime Minister Erdogan does have legitimate complaints about Twitter and YouTube. Those audio and video files were acquired illegally. Laws were broken. But on one of those files, you can clearly hear Erdogan intimidating a news channel. His government jails more journalists than any other and uses its tax authorities to punish news outlets he considers hostile. Given all of that, and the corruption scandal, Tayyip Erdogan is not particularly well placed to claim the moral high ground.
Gerçekten bıçak kemiğe dayandı bu ülkede.
People have had enough in this country. The media group I work for was hit with a $4 billion tax fine just because it did journalism. Many of our colleagues who have tried to do independent journalism have spent years in jail. Many others have been silenced or fired by media organizations close to the government. So the Turkish media that have had to endure all this pain and oppression have started to retaliate. And after the Gezi protests, people in Turkey have overcome a wall of fear.
Our Global Village voice is now on the war of words and images in the Turkish Twitter sphere.
Shortly after the ban, all of the devoted Twitter users who were very active before were back on board, again, using other means, of course, including government officials, AK Party members, MPs, even the President Abdullah Gül himself. On the other hand, I think Turkey's image is tarnished as a democracy internationally.
By banning Twitter, Erdogan achieved what he wanted to do at the first place, to send a strong message to his voter base, whose immediate concerns aren't democracy, but more their poverty or how government provides them. Erdogan wants to present himself as a strong authoritarian leader, and he believes that Turks react to this in a positive manner. That's why he doesn't really care about what the international community will think, whether he'll be labeled as a dictator or an elected tyrant.
Time now for Listening Post News Bites. There's an old expression from the world of print journalism: hold the front page when news is breaking. In Pakistan this past week, it was a case of holding part of the front page. This is what Pakistani readers of the international edition of the New York Times saw on March 22nd. Part of the front page left blank. In other countries, the paper featured an extract from a forthcoming book by Times reporter Carlotta Gall, based on her 12 years reporting the war in neighboring Afghanistan. Gall reported that Pakistan's military intelligence agency, its Inter-Services Intelligence, or ISI, not only knew of the presence of Osama bin Laden in a safe house in northern Pakistan, but even had a special desk devoted to handling him. Gall also recounted brutal stories of physical violence against her by Pakistani agents while she was investigating links between the ISI and the Taliban. According to the Times, the Express Tribune, the Times' partner paper in Pakistan, took the decision to quash the story without the Times' knowledge. A spokesperson for the Times added, "While we understand that our publishing partners are sometimes faced with local pressures, we regret any censorship of our journalism." Gall herself made light of the situation on Twitter by posting a photo of the front page with the note, "Breakfast in Islamabad." The casualty figures say that Iraq is the second most dangerous country in the world to be a journalist, behind only Syria, and the latest victim was allegedly killed by a politician's bodyguard. Mohammed Badawi Obeid al-Shamari was the Baghdad bureau chief for the U.S.-funded Radio Free Iraq. He was shot dead at a checkpoint near the presidential palace in the capital March 22nd. Witnesses reportedly told Iraqi media Badawi was arguing with security guards at the checkpoint before they dragged him from his car and beat him. Then, they said, one of the guards shot him in the head from close range. Dozens of Iraqi journalists gathered at the scene in protest. They were joined by Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, who kissed the victim's body and vowed to arrest the killer, who was eventually taken into custody. Iraqi media reports quickly identified the alleged murderer as a Kurd, a member of Iraqi President Jalal Talabani's security detail. In the demonstrations that followed, many Iraqis complained about the routinely aggressive behavior of bodyguards working for politicians. A number of Iraqi newspapers then canceled their Sunday editions to protest the killing. Another reporter has left Bloomberg News, part of the ongoing fallout over Bloomberg's reporting on politics in China. Ben Richardson, an Asia editor-at-large for Bloomberg, announced his resignation this past week over a story that goes back 4 months, when the New York Times and the Financial Times both reported that Bloomberg executives had killed the publication of an article that explored financial ties between one of the wealthiest men in China and families of top Chinese leaders. Richardson is the second journalist to quit over the incident. "I left Bloomberg because of the way the story was mishandled," he told JimRomanesco.com, "and because of how the company made misleading statements in the global press." Just last week, Bloomberg's chairman, Peter Grauer, delivered a speech in Hong Kong suggesting the China story must be handled with care. "We have to be there," Grauer said, referring to China, "and that every once in a while we wander a little bit and write stories that we should have rethought." On that, Richardson said clearly there needs to be a robust debate about how the media engages with China. That debate isn't happening at Bloomberg. Staying in Southeast Asia, ever since its handover in 1997 from Britain to China, Hong Kong has been operating under a one-country, two-system rule. Beijing promised to preserve some of the city's economic and social autonomy from the mainland, including freedom of the press. For a while, Hong Kong enjoyed one of the freest media climates in the region. In 2003, it ranked 18th in the annual Press Freedom Index issued by Reporters Without Borders. However, 10 years later, the climate has changed, and Hong Kong now sits at number 61 in that same table. China is 5th from bottom. China watchers say Beijing is gradually taking control over Hong Kong, and the media are just a part of that. And what was once a haven for free speech is now a dateline where critical journalists are attacked, newspaper editors are self-censoring, and the government in Beijing is being urged to back off. The Listening Post's Gauri Sharma now on the slow but steady decline of press freedom in Hong Kong.
A gruesome scene on the streets of Hong Kong. On February 26th, Kevin Lau, a veteran of Hong Kong's journalistic corps, was attacked by two men with a cleaver. 11 people were arrested, but authorities initially ruled out any link to Lau's work as a journalist. From his hospital, Lau said he strongly disagreed with the Hong Kong police.
希望匯聚社會各界嘅力量，促請警方早日破案，令新聞工作者可以對法治重拾信心，無需恐懼暴力威脅。
6 weeks before the attack, he had been removed as editor of the muckraking newspaper Ming Pao. His replacement was known to have pro-Beijing sympathies. According to other journalists in Hong Kong, the attack on Lau had everything to do with his journalism.
I cannot simply think of any personal reasons that can justify the attack. He's financially stable, he has a happy family, and all we can think about is what he has done and what Ming Pao has done. Ming Pao is one of the few independent voices in Hong Kong, and it's really famous of its investigative reports.
One could say you could not link this incident to press freedom, but all these coincidences added together will make Hong Kong journalists very worried that whether or not their freedom to report and to comment without fear has been eroded.
While editing Ming Pao, Lau collaborated in an investigation that revealed the hidden offshore assets of some of China's ruling elite. That story was published in January. Lau was fired within a month. To most of his colleagues, it was clear the investigation touched a nerve. The situation is so sensitive that people are reluctant to talk about it on camera, and those that do want their anonymity preserved.
This attack shouldn't be seen in isolation. It's just the latest in a series of attacks that have steadily eroded press freedom. It's come to a point when journalists are really hoping that authorities in Hong Kong or Beijing will give them a guarantee that journalists will be protected and that this won't keep happening.
Media workers have reason to be nervous. Last year alone, the Hong Kong Journalists Association recorded at least 6 attacks on the media, including the storming of the offices of Next Media, a company known for its cutting-edge animation, and an assault on Chen Ping, the publisher of political weekly Ice and Affairs. Then there were the journalists pushed out of their jobs, like Li Wei-ling, an outspoken radio host who says she was removed from her job for criticising governments in China and Hong Kong. But there are other issues media watchers are concerned about. Large parts of Hong Kong's media are owned by business tycoons with ties to the mainland. Richard Lee is the owner of the Hong Kong Economic Journal. His father, Li Ka-shing, is one of the most influential businessmen in China. Malaysian billionaire Robert Kwok owns the South China Morning Post and has huge investments in China. Analysts say such relationships with the mainland have had an impact on the independence of media in Hong Kong. Another way Beijing is changing the media landscape is by inserting political allies within news outlets. The South China Morning Post has been a Hong Kong institution since 1903 and the city's leading English-language newspaper. In 2012, the paper appointed its first editor from the mainland, Wang Jingwei.
It is reasonable for people to speculate whether his background and his political inclination will be very much pro-China to the extent that he may not be an independent editor. But on the other hand, of course, he's also a journalist by profession. He has a lot of experience, so one can never pin down on whether the move is a politically motivated one.
Since Jiang Wei has been editor, the situation has worsened. The most spectacular incident was of the coverage of a blind dissident who died in suspicious circumstances on the mainland. The story was meant to run quite prominently on South China Morning Post, but it was cut down to a nib and pushed to the back pages. A senior editor who questioned that decision was told by Wang that he didn't have to explain anything to him, and if he didn't like it, he could leave. It raised concerns and protests outside the office.
There is certainly a tightening of media control. It comes in the form of self-censorship and also some direct interference from Beijing officials in Hong Kong. In some cases, we've seen
pages dictated by Beijing officials. Photos were added, headlines were changed, and some interview ideas were barred, and certain people were told not to speak to them.
But that's not how Hong Kong officials describe it. Starry Lee is both a member of the Legislative Council of Hong Kong and part of a pro-Beijing political party.
Hong Kong is still the heaven for media, and media are also free to say anything they want. If it is a censorship, it is the organization itself who decide. We can see every day, every program, they look at issue from different angles. Some criticize the government heavily, some will support the government in the way that Chinese government work. From my observation, Hong Kong's media do have basically full freedom in expressing their view.
But Beijing critics argue that wasn't the case during the 2012 election. According to a report in the South China Morning Post, the propaganda chief of China's representative agency in Hong Kong called the owner of the daily Hong Kong Economic Journal to complain about its critical coverage of the city's recently elected leader, Leng Chunying.
It seemed that the phone call worked because I know several senior journalists at Hong Kong Economic Journal, and they say still 2 years later, they're just basically more careful than they were in the past about being critical of the government. And that's very worrying that one phone call can make such a big impact.
I don't think there is concrete evidence saying that. From all these situations or from all these things happen in Hong Kong, I can conclude that we still enjoy a freedom of expression and media still enjoys a high degrees of autonomies.
When Hong Kong was returned to the Chinese 17 years ago, there were all kinds of concerns about how the city would change. Those changes are now happening. For decades, the Hong Kong media provided one of the few windows outsiders had into the China story. Beijing hasn't quite slammed that window shut, but it is closing. The proof is right there, in black and white.
More Global Village voices now on freedom of the press in Hong Kong.
There has been more direct pressure from mainland representatives on the media. There's also more owners of Hong Kong media that are now members of political assemblies in China. There's also a natural shift in Hong Kong media companies toward the mainland, to the extent that even new media startups that aren't willing to toe a pro-China line could really have trouble here. So that really does change the landscape.
Hong Kong has an underutilized watchdog opportunity when it comes to issues regarding the mainland. Although there is a slow erosion of civil liberties here, the press are free and there is freedom of speech. The thing is, commercial and political pressures from media owners have led to a cancerous trend of self-censorship amongst journalists.
Finally, this next video didn't start life as a video at all. It began as a piece of prose written by Kendra Ish, published on an American website, Timothy McSweeney's Internet Tendency. Then some Canadians at a stock footage company based in Calgary called Dissolve came up with an idea. As they described it, it was their moral imperative to put pictures to the writer's words and to include as many generic advertising cliches and stereotypes as possible. Scientists working with beakers, high-speed trains, wind turbines, the kind of evocative images media consumers get bombarded with all the time. They call it, "This is a generic brand video," and it's our web video of the week. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
We think first of vague words that are synonyms for progress and pair them with footage of a high-speed train. Science is doing lots of stuff that may or may not have anything to do with us. See how this guy in a lab coat holds up a beaker? That means we do research. See how we're part of the global economy? Look at those farmers in China. But we also do business in the USA, or want you to think we do. Also, we care about the environment, loosely. Here's some powerful rushing water and people planting trees. In today's high-speed environment, stop-motion footage of a city at night with cars turning quickly makes you think about doing things efficiently and time passing. Did we put a baby in here? What about an ethnic old man whose wrinkled smile represents the happiness and wisdom of the poor? Yep,